So, Khayran, welcome to the Doodling Lawyers YouTube channel. Thank you for taking the time in your busy schedule to come and join us and talk to us about sports law, or specifically SGBV in sports. And before we go any further, I'd like you to tell us who you are and what you do, so that, yeah, we can get to know you a bit more.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you very much. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be able to shed some light and be able to maybe educate and create the awareness around this topic and this very crucial area of sports. So just as an introduction, again, my name is Khayran Noor. I'm a sports law and governance specialist focusing on integrity, compliance, human rights, and safeguarding in sports. And just as a context for maybe people who are not very familiar with this space or what a sports lawyer really does. A sports lawyer is a lawyer who understands how law operates within the sports ecosystem, so including contracts, governance, dispute resolution, to the protection of athletes' rights and welfare. But essentially, we sit at the intersection of law and ethics and policy, so making sure that systems that govern sports are fair, transparent, and safe for everyone involved. And maybe just to build up on that same topic, since we're on this, and maybe some of you probably asking yourself what sports law really is. So again, sports law is the body of laws, policies, and regulations that govern all activities and relationships in sports. And as mentioned earlier, it can include contracts and commercial agreements, for example, in sponsorship, media rights, player contracts. It can cover governance and regulation, and this is how sports bodies are structured and held accountable. Talking about dispute resolution, athlete welfare and human rights, integrity issues, for example, match fixing and anti-doping. So in short, sports law ensures fairness, accountability, and protection in sports for all stakeholders involved in that space or working in that space. Yeah.
Wow, yeah, that's quite the intro. So, me being a lawyer who has never practiced sports law, I have never known the depth of sports law, or the wide how wide the field actually is. Because I think
Yeah.
my limited understanding is when it comes to like contracting, because we always hear about, oh, this club has bought this footballer, but I really don't know what that means. And
Yeah.
now, when I came across this article on the Daily Nation a couple of weeks ago about
Yeah.
SGBV in sports, and how especially women trying to make it in sports usually
Yeah.
have to go through so many hurdles just to make it. And those
Mm.
hurdles are usually exploitative in nature. They usually, what I read in that article was more about sexual exploitation among
Yes.
our elite athletes in E10. And we all know that
Yeah.
E10 is like I don't know, where all the top athletes go to train. And
Yeah.
Kenya being a country that is very, very proud of our athletes, these women and men who go out there, represent us, and bring back medals home, it came as a very, very big shock. So, what
Yeah.
went through your mind as you read that article? And is this something that is just common, just that we don't know about it?
Yeah. So when you talk about safeguarding, again, maybe just to again give a brief overview. Safeguarding in sports refers to the policies, systems, and practices that are designed to ensure that everyone involved in sports, especially children and vulnerable adults, in this case, for example, now would be women and girls, persons with disability, are protected from harm. And this would include, and it's not limited to, preventing, for example, sexual, physical, emotional abuse or neglect, promoting safe reporting channels, and ensuring vetted personnel and safe environment. But for the context of this interview, and I think it's crucial for me to point out that safeguarding in sports is very broad, is a very broad concept that applies to everyone involved in the sporting system, not only athletes, but also coaches, team staff, administrators, volunteers, match officials, media personnel, and spectators. And likewise, safeguarding also goes beyond responding to abuse, harassment, and discrimination, and it can also involve ensuring safe environment, promoting well-being and preventing exploitation, and also supporting mental health, emotional and physical welfare. So But for the purpose of this interview, however, we will focus specifically on safeguarding as it relates to abuse, harassment, misconduct affecting women and girls in sports, and recognizing that there's only one part of our wider safeguarding framework. So in regards to the article that you've just mentioned with the Daily Nation from A10, I think for me it was heartbreaking, yes, but sadly not surprising, as you've maybe pointed out. And but essentially, what struck me the most was how preventable so much of it was. So when you see repeated patterns, we always hear about coaches abusing power. We hear about young women isolated. We hear how most of the time federations are also slow to act. You realize that these are not just random incidents, they're also systemic, or rather, they are systemic governance failures. So these stories highlight the urgent need for athlete protection mechanisms that go beyond reactionary bans. So we need early warning systems. In that sense, we're talking about background checks. We need to have safeguarding training. We need to have independent reporting pathways. And most importantly, have accountability that does not depend on who holds the power. And for me, that is exactly why, maybe just to throw it out there, why I developed the Safeguarding in Sport framework to provide a structured, independent, and survivor-centered approach to preventing and responding to abuse across Kenya's sports system and, of course, on the regional and also global landscape. Yeah.
Okay, so this isn't just a Kenyan problem. We also have the same issue regionally.
It's actually a global issue. And maybe when we move along, I'll also give some examples and some
Mhm.
cases where this has come out in other countries and in maybe other countries that we normally deem them as developed in
Yeah.
terms of the regulatory framework, etc. So just to give more context in that sense, I'll give some examples as we move along.
Okay, and we'll also briefly mention the framework that you've talked about. I believe it's something you've worked on, and it's going to be launched soon. So you'll mention it, and then we can also share the resource where people can interact with this framework that you've
Yeah.
developed.
Yeah.
So can you tell me, like, how does this systemic issue look like if you're looking at it from the Kenyan perspective, regional, and also global perspective, also with example and maybe some numbers? Because as I was reading more about this, I saw that a very, very small percentage of people actually report abuse against them. Is it because they're of fear of reprisal? Are they afraid that they're a fear of retaliation? Or just
Yeah.
that the system isn't built in a way to support people who are undergoing this kind of abuse?
Yeah. So yes, so this is going to be sort of more wider net response. So when you look at Kenya, again, as mentioned earlier, the problem is more widespread than most people realize. In a recent study that was conducted by Aga Khan University that covered across Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, it found that 69% of the respondents in Kenya have either experienced or known someone who has experienced sexual or gender-based violence in sports. And this goes to show us that this is not about a few bad apples, it's structural. So we're talking about power dynamics, again, lack of reporting mechanisms and cultural stigma, which make athletes, especially young women, especially extremely vulnerable. And so we see that the Kenya Academy of Sports policy for safeguarding that was developed in 2022 was an important step, yes, but it largely applied at an institutional level. So what we're seeking to do now is extending that protection more comprehensively in covering from federations to clubs, schools, and community academies that currently have little to no oversight. And so that sort of gives an overview of national level, but let's look at what about beyond Kenya. So when you look at for example, East Africa and the continental landscape, regionally, we also see similar patterns. Again, coaches and administrators holding unchecked power. We're talking about inadequate safeguarding policies and fear of retaliation, as you've mentioned. With the recent cases, again, as I said earlier, I'll give examples. We had the Mali women's basketball team, and we also have Gabon under 17 football cases that showed us how these dynamics play out where there's no independent oversight. And it's also a reminder that abuse thrives where institutions fail to act. So those failures are not limited by geography, they're about governance gaps. And moving on to global level, so we've seen, as I've said earlier, it's not a local or regional failure of system or just a regional issue. We've seen countries with advanced systems have major safeguarding crises. So think of the Larry Nassar case in the USA gymnastics, or the White Review in British gymnastics, and the recent, of course, Hockey Canada scandals involving sexual misconduct and systemic cover-ups. So again, these are examples that demonstrate that safeguarding failures are not limited to Global South. They reflect universal structural weaknesses. So we're talking about power imbalances again, institutional protectionism, and the silencing of victims. So while Kenya's legal and institutional frameworks may differ, but the underlying challenge is the same everywhere. And this is how sport safe without fear, or rather, how to make sport safe without fear of silence. And allow me, if I hope maybe we have time to expand on this, but I would like to maybe give more context in the cases that I mentioned. With the Mali business, women's basketball case, this is a 2021 investigation which revealed allegations of sexual abuse of underage female players by coaches in Mali's national basketball program. And the systemic abuse reportedly covered over several years and highlighted failures again in local oversight and reporting mechanisms. So the case drew global concern, of course, prompting intervention from FIBA, which is the International Basketball Federation. And we also saw increased advocacy for the Africa-wide safeguarding forums and sanctions against implicated officials. With the Gabon under-17 football case, I believe this was covered by an expose by BBC. So maybe you can be able to access this on YouTube at your free time. But again, in Gabon, multiple youth football coaches, some working with national underage 17 players or national under 17 players, were accused of sexually abusing young athletes. So the issue again came to light in 2020 following media investigations that uncovered long-standing patterns of abuse enabled by weak governances, systems again, patronage systems, and inadequate protective structures. So the case again underscored how vulnerable children are in high-performance academies or high-performance sports frameworks or structures when institutions again lack independent reporting and disciplinary mechanisms. Now, in the case of Larry Nassar, which is Larry Nassar, who was the USA gymnastics doctor, was convicted of sexually abusing more than 150 gymnastics over 2 decades, systemic organization cover-ups, and triggered widespread reforms, including the creation of US Center for Safe Sport. With the White Review, with the British gymnastics again, which is now, this is a 2022 report, examined widespread allegations of physical and emotional abuse in British gymnastics. Findings include abusive training methods, weight shaming, and unsafe environments often normalized under the guise of high performance. And the review again highlighted failures of reporting systems, lack of athlete voice, and culture prioritizing medals over welfare. So again, leading to sweeping safeguarding reforms under the rug. With the Hockey Canada sexual misconduct scandals, we're talking about a series of sexual misconduct, again, sexual misconduct allegations involving junior and national ice hockey players, revealed again deep systemic issues. Investigation showed organizational cultures of silence, non-disclosure agreements, and opaque settlement practices that protected perpetrators rather than the survivors of abuse. And again, this scandal prompted federal funding suspensions, leadership resignation, and major reforms. So I think this sort of gives an understanding of the or rather the scale is one thing and what protections are actually in place. So maybe just to give you now room to maybe go on to the next question, but I'd like to go ahead and now highlight further why, or rather how the systemic issues come to play in this case. Yeah.
Yeah, this is way worse than I thought. Like, I think if you didn't have any time limitations, you'd give us like even more examples, which would be even more
Yeah.
sensitive to us. And it seems
Yeah.
that these perpetrators are usually people who are placed in a position of a duty. They have a duty of care towards the athletes.
Yes.
Their job is to
Yes.
protect them, to train them, to help them become the best versions of themselves. But instead,
Yeah.
they are the abusers. And when you talk about the systemic issue and cover-ups and protecting the perpetrators rather than the survivors, what would independent oversight look like? Because you've mentioned independent oversight quite a bit. So, for example,
Yeah.
let's talk about Athletics Kenya. You talked about the framework or the policy by the Kenya Academy of Sports that is
Yeah.
mostly focusing at an institutional level. So, is it, for
Yeah.
example, the volleyball federation is in charge of its people, the football federation is in charge of its people, but there's no overall umbrella body that looks into
Yeah.
safeguarding?
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, yeah, essentially, an independent oversight system would work in that sense because, as we see at the moment, most structures where they do have safeguarding structures is that, as you give the example of Athletics Kenya, would have its own policy, which is adopted now on the organization level, maybe now stemming from World Athletics and then coming on to the Athletics Kenya. And then within the organization, you now have like a safeguarding officer who would now be in charge of now receiving reports, doing investigations, and now, just generally even doing vetting before hiring, say, for example, coaches or administrators in the organization. But I think maybe just to move on a bit from that is that I would like to also point out that in as much as we've raised these issues that are happening, I think it's also positive to mention that Kenya has made important progress so far. So, for example, safeguarding right now can be covered under the Children's Act 2022. We have the Sexual Offences Act, and the Sports Act itself also create legal basis for athletes protection. So in practice, some federations and clubs have started introducing safeguarding officers. They have codes of conduct and reporting channels. But the truth is, again, is that implementation is uneven. So we see that, for example, many community clubs and academies still operate with little oversight, no vetting, and no training on how to handle disclosures. Again, what's missing is an independent structure that athletes can trust. So one that ensures that reports are handled professionally and survivors are supported. So that's where national frameworks and coordinated policies would come in, not as a bureaucracy, but as a protection. So for me, I believe the gap is precisely what needs to be addressed. So aligning with the Academy of Sports Policy, Safeguarding Policy 2022, but then filling in the missing link between policy and practice. So by introducing mechanisms for prevention, reporting, and case management that can be applied across every level of sport. And again, the gap is precisely what needs to be addressed in the sense that, basically what I've mentioned now, when you talk about prevention, so that it becomes more of a, rather than being reactive, we already have system in place that can prevent this abuse to happen. Because most of the time we've noticed that by the time a scandal comes out, it's already a huge number and it's span over many years or many years. And it's something that, for example, if you look at almost all of these cases, it's not something that no one knew about it completely. Someone somewhere knew, someone somewhere may have reported, someone somewhere may have spoken or told someone about it, but no one did anything.
Yeah.
And this is how some of these now continue going on for a long period of time and end up having a big number of victims. You have too many people whose lives have been affected that even when you start the repair or the support system that can help them recover from these traumas and these abuses, it's far too widespread, it's far too damaging, and it just becomes something that is almost it probably like needs a whole overhaul of the whole system that has been there in place. Because again, you always ask yourself, the leaders who were there, what were they doing? Why was this not cut very early on in the stage, and to prevent having these hundreds of numbers coming out many years of time. These are people already probably in their adult life. You're re-traumatizing them again in wanting for them to relive those experiences they've already sort of moved on from, or maybe just found a way to survive in life. So I think it's just something that we need to have measures in place where realistically, we cannot eradicate the issue altogether, but at least minimize it to a point that we don't have these sort of numbers coming out all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, we always have this gap between policy and practice or implementation. Like we have a very
Yeah.
good set of laws on different, not just sports, like literally talk to any person in the
Everywhere.
governance
Yeah.
space, whatever field they're in, and they'll be like, yes, we have a very good law, we just don't have implementation. And actually,
Yeah.
when you were talking about vetting, I remembered this story I read about I don't know if it was Zimbabwe or the national team, and the coach that was supposed to train the national team for the Olympics had was it I don't know if it was criminal charges, but there was something about
Yeah.
sexual misconduct in his past.
Yes.
How do such people
Yes.
still get appointments? Or maybe you can tell us a bit about it, because I don't have the facts really. So how is it that there's a system that can actually see, we can catch that this person has sexual misconduct in their past? So how are they still
Mm.
allowed to be in charge of young, vulnerable? And I think it was the women's swimming team, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
How does
Yeah.
that happen?
Yeah. Again, I think maybe checks and balances again, looking at the integrity issues before we bring people in, for example, in such roles as you've mentioned. And surprisingly, again, it's not unique. In Kenya, we recently had a similar issue where someone who was actually convicted of sexual offenses of two minors abroad was appointed for, or rather under the anti-doping, as an anti-doping, I think, integrity board. I forgot the actual title. But I think, again, it's not just the vetting issue, because as you say, these are things that are known. It's a public knowledge. Everyone knew this guy has this either record on him, and in the first place should not be anywhere close to sports, not just for underage athletes, but generally should not be in the sports ecosystem as a whole. When you look at it on the integrity perspective. But I think again is the implementation side of it that lacks with putting these things into practice. But then again, I think also when it comes to safeguarding, we've not really prioritized it enough to make it as the number one rule in all the leadership positions. So as you mentioned, it's not just in sports, but it almost all spheres of leadership. We've seen even we've seen even the rulers of a country who are being appointed or voted in regardless of the blemishes they have, that essentially shouldn't be even considered to be leaders of a country, of an organization altogether. But I think for me is that we really need to put that as a priority in all spheres of our lives. If someone already has these questionable characteristics on them, they should not even be considered in the first place to be in leadership positions at all. So I think when it comes to safeguarding, that should be like a blanket rule. Yeah, and not just in safeguarding, but in all integrity issues, in all matters of good governance and integrity, and making sure that things are run the way it should, but making sure that the leaders we put in place are also people who are able to safeguard that space and able to uphold the same standards that what we expected. Because again, if we look at it in the constitution, in our almost all, I mean, in our legislation, if you look at, for example, the EACC, these are some of the things that already exist, as you said, on paper, but when it comes into practice, we always act on a reaction level.
Yes.
Is someone being investigated when they're already in the leadership position? We hear about corruption scandals, we hear about all these other issues coming up, but these are some of the things that most likely were already known about that person before they came into power. So where were these mechanisms before and not after? Yeah.
Preventative measures rather than reactionary measures. And so when we're
Yes.
talking about bridging the gap between policy and practice, so
Yeah.
how do other institutions come into play? For example, law enforcement.
Yeah.
Are law enforcement agencies properly trained on safeguarding? Do they have the training it takes to handle reports of SGBV? And how
Yeah.
supportive is that system towards athletes who are going to them with these complaints?
Yeah, if at all.
Yeah.
So when you talk about law enforcement, I believe that they play a critical role when abuse crosses, of course, crosses criminal territory. So, but sports-related cases require sensitivity and coordination. So too often we find that investigations are slow. Victims are either re-traumatized and cases collapse for the lack of evidence or institutional cooperation. So again, the police and sports bodies must work hand in hand and not in silos. So we need specialist training for officers on handling sport-related abuse and stronger referral systems between federations and statutory authorities. And I think, again, these referrals, protocols, and clear escalation pathways are part of what needs to be built in the system. So by ensuring that the transition from sports governance to criminal justice is smooth and survivor-centered. And for example, if I was to change maybe three things right now to make sports safer for women and girls in Kenya, how would that look like is first, by creating independent safeguarding and case management units in every major federation. And that way they're empowered to investigate, they're empowered to act and refer cases externally when needed. So now that would be where law enforcement is involved. And again, second would be make safeguarding training and background checks mandatory for anyone working with young athletes, and not just young athletes, but again, all members of the community in sports. So be it women, be it persons with disability, be it boys or men or women, and it should be from grassroots level to elite levels. And thirdly would be ensure that survivors are supported through psychological, medical, and legal systems. So making sure that it's embedded in the systems from reporting must lead to care. So not punishment or stigma, which is what we see most of the time. And the three steps alone, I believe, would drastically shift the culture from silence to safety. And I think this is where now, for example, accountability would really sit with federations, government, and law enforcement.
Okay, yeah. So actually, you've answered my next question already. I was going to ask you, like, what are just three things we can do? But also, why don't we talk about some pockets of sunshine? What are some good things happening when it comes to safeguarding in sports?
Yeah, I think again, because as mentioned earlier, in as much as we have some progress that is being made, we still see there's still some gaps to be filled. And unfortunately, again, because we have not prioritized it enough, so some of these things maybe are not even raised on the national level, for example. So we still see cases coming up, and maybe the ones that we've been able to mention are just like a tip of the iceberg, because these are the few that have been reported. We're talking about many others that have not even come to light, many others that have not come into the limelight, many others which people have not even spoken about, leave alone being reported. So maybe by the time we see numbers being less, because again, as mentioned earlier, this Aga Khan report, which is from this year, already talks about 69%. Maybe by the time we hear of 20% or 10% is where we could say we're on the right track. But I think we still have a lot to do. We still have a lot of awareness, education, and capacity building on a national and global level for us to be able to actually reach that stage where we can say we're doing something positive and impactful in the space of safeguarding.
So, as ordinary citizens, I'm counting myself and everyone else who doesn't practice sports law or isn't in the sports ecosystem. Is there anything that we can do to contribute to the awareness creation, or even just to taking us closer to a place where safeguarding is prioritized?
Yeah, I think again, safeguarding is everyone's responsibility, and so to speak, accountability is shared. So, but in as much before we can throw this out to now, say for example, ordinary citizens. But I think again, like I said earlier, it starts with leadership. So federations should work on a prevention internal enforcement mechanism. In that sense, they must oversee daily athlete environments. So they must make sure that they create safe spaces, they enforce conduct standards, they investigate complaints and suspend or remove perpetrators. So when federations are already seen to lead, cultural change begins from within. So on the same hand, government should plays a major role in this, in the sense that they create the laws, the resources, and oversight. So they set national safeguarding standards, fund safeguarding infrastructure, monitor compliance, and also penalize non-compliance. This means that law means little without funding, oversight, and enforcement. Because if you have, again, that good policy on paper, but if it's not being put into practice and there's no funding, oversight mechanisms there, we see that then it becomes just collects dust on the shelf. And when you talk about, again, law enforcement and the criminal justice, so when abuse is criminal, police must act quickly and sensitively. So investigating promptly, working with safeguarding units, avoiding re-traumatizing, and building strong cases, and that in that sense, making the police response reassuring survivors and deters abuse from, or rather deters abusers from conducting such acts. So I think for me would be when federations, government, and law enforcement are able to work together under clear national safeguarding standards, protection becomes consistent and credible. And when they act alone or pass responsibility around, survivors also fall through the gaps, and it creates harmful cultures that continue to persist. As mentioned earlier, shared leadership is essential in building safe and trustworthy sporting ecosystems. So, for example, now moving beyond the laws and policies, as you asked, what can ordinary people do? So we're talking about maybe parents, fans, sponsors, and teammates. So a safeguarding sporting culture, as I said earlier, starts with everyone. So we're talking about policies and laws being important, but real change depends on everyday behaviors and community vigilance. So, for example, parents, what are the responsibilities of parents? Parents can play a powerful preventive role, for example, by being informed and asking simple questions. So today, if a parent stands up and says, "Who is supervising my child? Has the coach been vetted? What is the reporting process if something happens?" The engagement already signals to the coaches that safety is monitored, and it encourages athletes to also speak openly and helps identify unsafe environments early. When it comes to the funds and sponsors, funds and sponsors hold influence through their voices and money. So demanding transparency and integrity from sports organizations, boycotting or withdrawing funding from unsafe programs, support athletes publicly who speak out rather than victimizing or rather victim shaming. So when sponsors and supporters take a stand, federations are pushed to change. When you look at now teammates and fellow athletes, teammates are often fast to recognize when someone is not okay. So they can look out for each other, notice the red flags, encourage reporting, and stand with the survivors. So peer support can make the difference between silence and speaking out. And of course, again, maybe by asking yourself why this matters is that silence enables abuse. Visibility, solidarity, and shared responsibility help prevent harm, especially where formal systems are not strong. So by creating a safe culture, by moving beyond compliance, it requires people who care, pay attention, and act. And when communities are engaged, athletes are safe and perpetrators lose power.
Oh, wow. Yeah, at least I can see my role. I'm not really a sports person, but I know a lot of people who
No, but
are
even
into
just
sports.
creating this conversation and
Yeah,
wanting to create the awareness, that's already something that you're
that's really
contributing to
something.
that. So this is
Mhm.
one of the ways we can be able to, act as a community, because again, it takes a village. And if you're all able to stand together in the sense that we don't look at safeguarding as a shameful or as a taboo, and we're able to speak about it, create awareness around it, educate people in all our spheres of life, by encouraging victims to speak out, because most of the time we see victims being shamed for speaking out rather than the other way around, and then perpetrators are still given that power where they're again, sadly, to use the same word, they're safeguarded from the actions that they've already committed. And again, now you see people seeing that the systems are not there to support them. So why should I speak out? Because if today I'm going to talk about this, someone would either blame me for putting myself in that position. For example, someone would ask me, why were you there in the first place? Rather than asking, why did that person do that act to me?
Yeah.
Shaming athletes where, for example, moving beyond shaming, but we've seen also athletes who've undergone repercussions, and maybe there's a word I'm looking for, this escaping my mind, but where they suffer consequences for speaking out. So we've seen either they might lose their national team selection positions, they might not be put in competitions, they might not even be included in training anymore. So you see that they end up suffering more than getting any help. So when someone else is seeing that, they always ask themselves, why should I go ahead and speak out? So let me just suffer in silence. At least I still get to play my sport. I at least continue to build up my career in sport, and I'll deal with this issue when the time comes. So at this point, the system doesn't favor me. It still favors the people who abusing and harassing and all that. But so it's not somewhere where it's survivor-centered or athlete-centered approaches where we offer or rather we empower the athletes to speak out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because even for a lot of these athletes, this sport is their lifeline. It's their
Yes.
way to support their entire family and their entire village.
Yeah.
So if this is going to jeopardize my career, then I'm just going to
Yeah.
stay silent. I'd rather suffer in silence. Yeah, so you've just given us very, very useful pointers on how we can all be a part of safeguarding when it comes to sports, from fans to fellow teammates, etc., etc. And honestly, I even hate to ask this because it kind of places the burden on the victim instead of the perpetrator or the government. But if I was a young female athlete and I were to find
Yeah.
myself in a situation
Yeah.
where I'm facing coercion or abuse, what steps would I take?
I think my advice would be start by telling someone you trust. It could be a parent, it could be a teacher, it could be a senior athlete who you consider a leader or maybe more influential than you. It could be a safeguarding officer if there are any. And again, if you're afraid to share openly, you can use anonymous reporting channels, again, if they're available. If possible, keep notes or messages about what happened. They can help if you choose to take the further action. Seeking again medical, psychological, legal support is also important and can help you, stay safe and informed. Unfortunately, as we speak about this, we're talking about this on when these things are actually available or resources are available for athletes to get this. But I think if we can encourage people to just speak out and just realizing that most importantly, you are not at fault and people who abuse power rely on silence. So speaking up is a powerful step toward protecting yourself and others. And everyone deserves to train, grow, and thrive in an environment where you feel respected, supported, and safe. So we need to sort of be the champions of change and also realizing that your safety is your right. So no opportunity in sport is worth compromising that. And if something feels or wrong, trust your instincts because if something feels uncomfortable most of the time it is. So I think I know it's sort of maybe speaking on a point of privilege, but there's power in speaking out. And many people who've been able to create a change and make impact in their societies in many spheres of life is by being able to have that courage to speak out because again you also have to realize you're not just fighting your own fight but you're fighting everyone else's fight because if it's happening to you it's most definitely happening to someone else. So by you keeping quiet means that there's many others that will come before you or others who might be suffering the same thing in silence. And again, perpetrators gain power from silence. So if no one speaks about it, no one calls them out, no one stands up against them, they derive that they derive that power and continue to do what or rather what they've been doing and what they do because they're protected in some way. So they just feel like they're invincible and they can continue doing what they want and no one will ever catch, or rather it would not catch up with them, which sadly it takes too long for it to catch up with them, but I think eventually the truth comes out. But someone somewhere always has to do something about it because if we don't, then as we see, it can continue without any help or any repercussions being seen, especially against the perpetrators. Yeah. And the people who protect them in the system. Yeah.
And we saw that very powerfully, the power of speaking out with the Me Too movement. It just started with one voice and it became a
Yeah.
global movement. We also saw it with a recent memoir by the late Virginia, just one person deciding to speak up and an empire is tumbling. So yeah,
Yeah.
I am with you there. Just it just takes one person speaking out, and
Mm.
the dominoes just start falling. Yeah. So
Exactly.
now,
I was just about to use the same word, the domino effect. You remove one and the whole thing topples down. Yeah. So, yeah, I think, but most importantly, again, in as much as, yes, we want to encourage and we want to empower athletes, but we also need, again, create the awareness around this because most of the time, abuse is not as obvious as we make it seem to be.
Mhm.
Someone might be going through it and not realize they're being abused. And because again, abuse doesn't always appear in sexual nature. So it could be a coach harassing you, as we've seen in the gymnastic case, being shamed because you weigh more and you have to attain a certain weight minimum. And so someone may now go ahead and start not eating. So they have poor eating habits. They're shamed into even eating well or taking care of themselves because they don't want to cross a certain weight number. It could be being bullied even by your peers. So not just coaches or people in power in that in the structure dynamic that we look, but even peers can abuse. So athletes can abuse other athletes. And I think yes, again, it's a widespread issue. It's something that can cover in different dynamics and not just sexual in nature, but in so many other ways. We've talked about physical, emotional, and psychological abuse. So, in creating that awareness and educating people to even realize that they're being abused, or even recognizing the signs of being abused, recognize signs of grooming, because again, by the time someone goes ahead and sexually abuses you, when you talk about now sexual abuses, someone has groomed you to a point that you sort of feel like you're the favorite one, or
Mhm.
either he's doing you a favor, or they love you, or they're affectionate to you by doing these acts to you, where if you look at it now, or if you're able to understand, you actually realize it's an abuse and not something that it's positive on your end. So again, also look at the power dynamics where a coach takes advantage of an athlete, but in some cases you'll see that they claim they're in a relationship. But again, you have a again, to use the same word, you have a power dynamic over this person. Maybe they're not really interested in you. Maybe they're not really into you in that way, but they feel like, if I remain in the good side, or I'm on the right side of this person, I'll be able to gain favors. I'll be able to be selected for teams. I'll be able to maybe be trained properly and get some added attention and all that stuff. So I think the major step towards empowering is we need to make sure that we have proper awareness, and that everyone needs to be educated on these issues. And then, of course, now beyond that, empower people to speak out by having now anonymous reporting mechanisms where investigations are done well without re-traumatizing, and we have independent oversight, for example, where someone feels that the internal organizational frameworks don't really work. There's an organization that can come in and step in and say, you know what, let's overlook this and make sure that everything is done properly. And yeah, and when we actually now start seeing that people are being put, or rather, they suffer consequences from the actions that they do, and you actually see examples of that, many people now will have more confidence to speak out because they can say, okay, at least we can see something will come out of it. We can see that we're being protected. We can see that they actually are being put into, you know, again, I don't want to use repercussions, but they're being now
Being held to account, they're
helping
facing the
out, yes,
consequences.
being held to account, and the system is being accountable to these actions. So, in that sense, then the movement can become more impactful and more widespread and intentional in that sense. Yeah.
Nice, nice. Okay. So maybe
Yeah.
there is some light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
Hopefully it's not a train.
Yeah.
It's just, daylight.
Yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic that
Yeah.
somewhere down the line, we'll see a more positive impact. But again, like I said earlier, there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still so much we need to do for us to be able to change this space and make it safe for everyone. Yeah.
Great. So I think now we are at the point where we can be wrapping up. And do you have any
Yeah.
final takeaway for the people watching this before we go and talk about? Oh, yeah, we were supposed to talk about the legal framework you developed. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about it.
Yeah. So maybe just to briefly highlight it, because again, we've already published this last week, so most of the information is already out there. But the safeguarding in sport framework essentially was developed to strengthen protection, inclusion, and accountability across sporting environments in Kenya and the wider African region. It provides a structured yet adaptable blueprint, and that's why it's called a framework and a blueprint, not a policy, so that organizations, federations, and institutions can adopt or tailor to ensure sport is safe, respectable, and empowering space for all participants. And why we developed the safeguarding framework was because while sports again offers tremendous social and development benefits, it also exposes participants, particularly children, women, and persons with disability, to risk of abuse, exploitation, discrimination, and neglect. And again, Kenya, like much of Africa, has lacked a unified national safeguarding policy in sport. So the framework sort of, or rather aims to respond to this gap by consolidating international best practices and local realities in one coherent guide. And again, the motivation behind this framework stems from a shared recognition that safe sport is a human right. So high-profile global and regional abuse scandals, like the ones we mentioned, such as those in gymnastics, basketball, and football, generally expose systemic failures of prevention and accountability. So this framework was therefore designed as both a preventative and corrective mechanism. So to stop harm before it occurs, and if it does occur, to be able to respond effectively when it does. And I think essentially it was also to reflect the commitment to upholding human dignity and equality in sports, promoting integrity, ethics, and good governance, and again build trust, inclusion, and confidence across all levels of sports, so from grassroots to elite. And what we hope to achieve with this framework, again, the key objectives, of course, as we mentioned, is to prevent and respond to abuse, harassment, and exploitation in sports, be able to standardize, say, safeguarding systems across federations, clubs, and institutions, and again, be able to empower stakeholders through education, training, and awareness, so that we can also be able to establish independent mechanisms for reporting, case management, and victim support. And at the same time, strengthen governance and oversight through clear accountability rules, but then again, also promote inclusivity and disability sensitive safeguarding policies. So it's both a policy guide and a capacity building tool, complete with an implementation plan again, with codes of conduct, reporting templates, and a training manual. And the gap we seek to fill with this framework. So before this initiative, again, safeguarding efforts in sports across Kenya and Africa were fragmented and reactive. So with limited alignment with legal policy and operational levels, the framework closes that gap by one, providing a unified reference model for sports organization and policymakers. It also integrated international conventions. So we're talking about UNCRC, CEDAW, CRPD, with local laws such as the Children Act and Sexual Offences Act and Sports Act. It also aims to bridge the divide between policy intent and practice. So essentially at grassroots level, and also ensuring that, lastly, ensuring that safeguarding becomes a core pillar of sports governance and integrity, and not an afterthought. Sorry. So again, ways to collaborate would be this. Again, this framework is a living document, so one that will evolve through shared learning and partnerships. So again, we invite national and regional sports bodies, we invite government agencies and policymakers, also civil society and education institutions. We also invite international development partners and athlete association and grassroots clubs, because again, to collaborate in its implementation, localization, and monitoring. So I think for me, believe together we can build a culture of safe sport, inclusive and ethical sport across Africa. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. It sounds like a wonderful tool that can actually it responds to the questions we were asking. How do we bridge that gap? How do we bring it from from theoretical to practical? And
Yeah.
so if somebody watching this, if they forget everything else, what is the one thing you want them to remember from this conversation?
If I'm to just summarize everything, safeguarding in sport is ultimately about protecting the integrity of sports by protecting the people in it. So as we mentioned, the framework was developed to close that gap between policy and practice. So we must ensure that every athlete, coach, official, participant can operate in safe, inclusive, and accountable environment. We aim to bring together international human rights standards and local realities to create a practical safeguarding space that any organization, or rather every organization, should adopt. So we need to move beyond compliance, and we need to move now towards cultural change. So making safety, dignity, and respect part of how we define excellence in sports. And our goal is to build systems that prevent harm and respond effectively when it occurs, and also empower every stakeholder to take responsibility for safe sport.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. And if people want to come to you for collaboration, learn more about sports law, or even work with you when it comes to safeguarding, maybe in their own institutions, how do they get in touch with you, or where can they go to find out more about what you do?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, so feel free to share my LinkedIn profile or links to connect. I pride myself to responding to all messages, or rather, all all correspondence that comes through LinkedIn. And again, with the link that I shared with you earlier regarding the safeguarding framework, my email address is also available there. So anyone who maybe would want to know particularly partner, collaborate, or work with me, or rather work with us regarding the safeguarding framework specifically, can reach out to me on again both my email or LinkedIn. So those would be the best channels to reach me. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks. Yeah, I have those links. I have the link you shared about the framework. I'll add it to the description, and also your LinkedIn. So, yeah,
Yeah.
thank you so much. This was such a pleasure. I am coming out of this conversation with more knowledge about sports law. Now
Yeah.
I know what you do. I know you're a sports lawyer, but I didn't know exactly what you do.
Yeah. I mean, even what I shared in terms of what sports law really covered is probably again tip of the iceberg, because again sports law is
It's
very wide,
very
and
wide.
probably this forum was not the right one to actually delve deeper into that. But again, yeah, it's a very wide space. There's a lot one can do. So you can specialize as a sports lawyer, but then you can now specialize in a different now area, be it IP, be it governance, be it contracts, be it athlete welfare, be it agency. So it's a wide space, and dispute resolution. So again, everything you know about law, for me, I think sports has a space in it. So it's a space available for everyone. The cake is big enough for everyone, and yeah,
So yeah,
it's
I
a
hope
also
if there are any
interesting.
aspiring lawyers on this channel, they're going
Yeah.
to, or if there's some law student somewhere listening to you now, maybe
Yeah.
now they have a new path to explore. Yeah.
Yeah. And not just lawyers, I mean, even people who work in different spheres. So it could be insurance, could be administrative, could be again coaching, leadership in different areas. So sports again is not just for, maybe as we speak about sports law, yes, but I think even aspects of sports law don't necessarily apply to lawyers alone. So when you talk about good governance, integrity, accountability, all these things involve other people from other areas of expertise or specialization. So I think we're able to now work with almost everyone in the sector. So yeah, it's a space open for everyone.
Open space. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I think what now we'll be wrapping up. Thank you very much for your time, for your expertise, for your knowledge. You're a very wonderful guest, and I hope we'll have another conversation another time about one of the other spheres of sports law that we didn't even get to touch on today.
Yes. Thank you so much. And I think, as I said earlier, this was a very crucial topic for us to have And again, it covers the aspect that we're talking about, creating awareness and education. So I hope you, as you said yourself, you're coming out enlightened about this, and I hope more people will be able to gain something out of this interview, and hopefully we're all able to work together in making a change in the sports system. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, then you have a wonderful, is it evening or afternoon? Yeah, it's almost evening.
Afternoon.
The rest of
Yeah.
you, enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening.
Yeah.
And yeah, see you another time.